2013 Dia de Portugal Symposium for the Portuguese Fraternal Society of America. This year is being done on Aristides de Sousa Mendes. If you look around the room, there are 20 panels that circle the room, starting with number 1, ending with number 20. This is the exhibit that was compiled by the Sousa Mendes Foundation. Please take your time after the symposium, after our speakers, to look at the information that's contained on these panels. It is well worth the moment spent to see how all of this came about, what happened, and where it takes place in history. Our 3 speakers for the day is going to be the founder and founding director and former president of the Sousa Mendes Foundation, Miguel Avila, co-founder of the International Committee to commemorate Dr. Aristides de Sousa Mendes and Treasurer, and a visa recipient, Pierre Hahn. At this time, I would introduce Miguel Avila.
Well, first of all, thank you so much to the PFSA, to Tim Borges, for always believing in this cause and supporting the Sousa Mendes Foundation. I also am very honored to have Mr. Pierre Hahn with us, and also a good friend and Treasurer, who has been fighting for a lot of causes that are dear to our hearts. Timor-Leste being one of them, and it's Sousa Mendes being another. Also, on behalf of the Sousa Mendes Foundation, I wanted to again thank the PFSA and thank you all for being here. The Sousa Mendes Foundation was established in September 2010 and really continued the work that the International Committee to commemorate Dr. Sousa Mendes started in the 1980s. We wanted to bring the message to younger generations using the media in a different way to get the word out. So wanted to highlight 3 areas that the foundation is focusing on right now. One of those areas is really creating a database of all the visa recipients and their families. This has been an amazing work by a small group of people throughout the world. We have people in Canada, the US, and Belgium, Portugal, Brazil. They are looking at those lists of names from Bordeaux, from the consular book in Bordeaux, and really looking at those names. There's a lot of misspells, by the way, in that list. A Portuguese person writing down all these different names on there. And of course, there's typos that we found. But we've been connecting with a lot of families. We've identified close to 1,000 people so far. And people say that he saved 30,000 people. We don't know that yet for sure. We will know that one day. That's what we're trying to do. One of the success stories is a family in New York, the Moed family. The grandfather is a visa recipient, a well-known architect in New York City. His grandson graduated recently, also in architecture, and he was so moved by the story of Aristides Sousa Mendes that he basically took it upon himself to do a project to create a museum at his hometown in Cabanas de Viriato, Portugal. Right now, he's there with an exhibit that's being established in front of the old home that's in ruins right now, and it's been in ruins for about 60 years. And the grand opening is on June 20th. So that's a great success story there. We also have, the foundation is distributing a French language film about what happened in Bordeaux. And that film, we're working with PFSA to also bring that film here sometime later this year. But I wanted to spend most of my time, we're going to hear from Anne and from Mr. Hahn, but I wanted to spend a little bit of time on really understanding the man that Aristides Sousa Mendes was. He graduated from the University of Coimbra with his twin brother Cesar, and got a job as part of the diplomatic corps for the Portuguese government. And he went overseas very quickly, very early on, with his young wife and small children. And one of the first times that he got in trouble with his superiors, and you'll hear this story repeat itself, was he was in Zanzibar, Africa, where one of his children contracted malaria. And so he got on the first ship back to Portugal to treat the child, forgetting to inform the superiors that he was leaving the post. So he got reprimanded for that. And there's other cases also that happened in the early 19-teens. That leads to him being demoted. And in 1921, he gets an opportunity to come to California. And because he wasn't a consul general first class, there was no relocation package involved. So he had to pay his own way and his family's way to come to California. He already had 8 children by then. So they moved to California. And he's well established here with a home in Berkeley, the offices in San Francisco. And, you know, he's having the time of his life. And one day he's sitting down in his living room and he picks up a local newspaper called A Liberdade, one of the local Portuguese newspapers. And he sees a short article on there that catches his eye. That article says, philanthropy by, and it said the name of the fraternal organization. And he reads the short article and it basically describes 2 significant donations that Portuguese fraternal organization had given to 2 California organizations. One was the Sacred Heart Hospital in Hanford, which at the time was run by the Dominican Sisters, a Portuguese order, and the Oakland chapter of the American Red Cross to help victims of a natural disaster in Japan. And he gets really upset with that news. So why is that upsetting to him? You have to go back 2 months. He goes to the IDES Supreme Council and he requests a small token donation for the Portuguese orphans of World War I. Portugal had been involved in World War I, a lot of casualties and therefore a lot of orphans. The organization turned his request down, saying that there was no budget for such a thing. So he reads the story. All of a sudden there's these 2 significant donations, one in Hanford, one in Oakland. So he decides, I need to expose these people. I'm going to write a letter to the editor of A Liberdade. So he writes the letter. And what starts, and the reason I'm telling you this story is to really understand the man behind the diplomat, and to also understand the connection to how important that connection to California is. So this really, he writes that letter, gets published a few days later, and it really starts a big soap opera. So you got to think that right now we have 1 Portuguese newspaper in California. Okay, we had 3 in the Bay Area at that time. 2 of them were daily. So they needed information, they needed news to get to people, right? So nothing more than a bickering match between a fraternal society and the Consul General of Portugal. So this really gets escalated to the point where I've had it, I have to do something about it. So he calls his assistant at the consulate in San Francisco and says, from now on, these 3 notary publics, which by the way are directors of that fraternal society, are no longer allowed to notarize any paperwork that's accepted by this consul. And he publishes that in the newspaper as well. Make sure everybody understands that. He also forbids 2 of the 3 newspapers from even being delivered to the consulate in San Francisco. But he takes his time and he does write to Lisbon, to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to let him know that there's this situation going on. What he hears in reply kind of surprises him and upsets him. He hears, please reinstate the 3 notary publics and please stop writing to the newspaper. He forgets the first one and he goes, okay, I can deal with not writing to the newspaper anymore. So instead he has, not him, but the community was all worked up about this situation, that they really already had other people writing on his behalf, and so forth. So this went on from about September 1923 until July 1924. To the point where it escalated so much that influential folks within the Portuguese community here went to the US State Department. The US State Department then contacts the Portuguese delegation in Washington, D.C., and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Lisbon, and says, please take this guy out of here. So he gets invited to leave his post in San Francisco. Before he does, there's a reception at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco where people from the Portuguese community get together and pay homage to him and bid him farewell in his family. So in that event, by the way, that event was very well described in a newspaper article, including the complete list of all guests in attendance, over 100 people. He gets very emotional, and he says, this is a great community, I was very welcomed here. There's a few rotten people, but overall it's a great community. So from San Francisco, he leaves and he gets transferred to Brazil, to Maranhão and Porto Alegre, and he has another child there, and then he goes back to Europe. He has several posts, and then he ends up, in 1928, he ends up in Antwerp, Belgium. In Antwerp, with the exception of losing 2 children there, a newborn and a son who was at the university at the time. From a professional career, he had the time of his life there. He basically was the dean of all consul generals in Antwerp. He was very well connected with the king of Belgium at the time. And so he was having a great time. But then he would start hearing about what was happening to some minorities, the Jewish and some other undesirable folks in that part of Europe at the time. So the Portuguese government decides he's too much of a loose cannon to have in Antwerp during this time when, in Germany, Hitler was already in power, and we should send him someplace else. So he ends up in a quiet place called Bordeaux, France. So he transfers the family there. And he also has some petitions on why he shouldn't go there. He has children at the university and school in Belgium, but nonetheless he obeyed and he went to Bordeaux. So this is 1938 now, and by late 1939, things started getting bad. So he starts getting some requests for transit visas through the Portuguese consulate in Bordeaux. At that time, Circular 14, which is now a famous or infamous document from António de Oliveira Salazar, forbids any visas from being given out to a group of undesirables, including lists, including Jews, Russians, homosexuals, etc. And on occasion, starting late 1939, he gives them out, but it was one here, one there. Not a big deal. Probably in the confusion of the paperwork in Lisbon, nobody would notice. Then France, in 1940, France is occupied by the Nazis. And hundreds of thousands of refugees descend on Bordeaux. And he doesn't know what to do. He asks for guidance from Lisbon, and what he receives is do nothing. And he gets to a point where he says, I need to do something. He goes into his room for about 3 days, doesn't want to eat, probably didn't sleep much, and after those 3 days he comes out. He has a long beard from 3 days of not shaving, and he says, I'm going to save every single one of them. And that's what we call the act of conscience by Aristides de Sousa. And then he starts by establishing a process for which, how can they expedite these visas. And in the beginning, they were following the normal process. Here it goes to the secretary, stamps, collect the fees, etc., etc. After a day or so, that didn't work. Forget the stamps, forget collecting any dues for the transit visas, just sign anything. And it gets to a point where he starts signing on anything, any piece of paper, any document, so that people can go across the border through Spain to Portugal to get to freedom. So you'll hear a little bit more about his rehabilitation, and you hear about also from a visa recipient. But I wanted to also have you reflect on your own experiences. Any life-changing experience you might have had, or somebody in your family might have had. How difficult was that to make a decision? How did it change your lives? How did it change your family's lives? How did it change the next generation? So Aristides de Sousa Mendes knew very well that this was his decision to act in the way that he did would have a detrimental impact on his career, on his family, and even potentially on his future generations. So that decision, whether it's a family member of yours, yourself, changed everything. That decision to immigrate to a new country, that decision to marry somebody, that decision that you made where you had to make a decision for a loved one who was between life and death, that changes everything. And we're so glad that Aristides de Sousa Mendes made the decision that he did, because the world is such a better place today because of his actions. Muito obrigado.
And now we'll hear from one of the visa recipients, Monsieur.